Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. If I had known what I was walking into, I never would have taken the job. But when I first saw the ad for a night nurse position at Havenwood Senior Living, it sounded perfect. A peaceful, quiet facility nestled in the Vermont countryside, away from the chaos of city hospitals. The pay was decent, and the overnight shifts meant fewer patients to manage. Most residents would be asleep, leaving me with little more than routine checks and paperwork. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I spent my shift learning the layout, checking vitals, and familiarizing myself with the residents. The halls were wide and sterile, the scent of antiseptic barely masking the underlying notes of age and fading perfume. The only real noise came from the occasional beeping of a heart monitor or the rustle of blankets as someone shifted in their sleep. But by the end of my first week, I started noticing things. It began with the rules. The other night nurses, grizzled veterans of the job, handed them down with a mix of amusement and warning. At first, I thought they were just playing a joke on the new girl. Never acknowledge the empty rocking chair in room 217. It rocks on its own. I had laughed, expecting a smirk or a wink. But Nurse Linda only shook her head. "If you hear humming in the hallway, walk the other way," she added. I frowned. Why? Linda didn't answer right away. She just busied herself with paperwork before saying, "You'll know if it happens." And finally, the strangest one. "If you see Gordon pruning his roses, don't interrupt him. Just smile and keep walking." This one actually made me laugh. Gordon? You mean like one of the residents? Was, Linda corrected. Died last year, but sometimes he still does his rounds. I wanted to argue, to say they were just messing with me, but the look in Linda's eyes was steady, too steady. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the rules. And then I saw Gordon. It was a little after 3 a.m. during my rounds. I was walking past the main courtyard, a stretch of manicured lawn with flower beds surrounding a stone fountain. That's when I spotted a figure standing near the roses, an old man. He was slightly hunched, wearing a thin hospital gown over striped pajama pants. Wisps of white hair curled over his ears. In his hands he held an invisible pair of clippers, snipping at the air in a slow, rhythmic motion. Click. Pause. Click. I stopped, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. The courtyard was closed at night. No residents were supposed to be outside. "Sir?" I called softly. He didn't react, just kept trimming air that held no roses. A chill ran up my arms. I knew that posture, that face. I had seen it in one of the framed photos in the hallway, a memorial wall for the facility's lost residents. Gordon. I swallowed, suddenly remembering the warning. Just smile and keep walking. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my instincts at war with my logic. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a living resident who resembled him. Maybe I was overtired, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Click. I forced myself to move. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs as I turned away, keeping my pace steady, my breath even. I didn't look back. By the time I finished my rounds and looped back, the courtyard was empty. The only thing left was the faint scent of roses lingering in the cold night air. By the time the sun rose, I had almost convinced myself that what I saw in the courtyard had been a trick of the light, an overactive imagination mixed with exhaustion. But deep down, something gnawed at me. It wasn't just Gordon. It was the rules. The way the other nurses treated them not as superstition but as routine. I wanted answers. During my next shift, I found Linda in the break room, sipping coffee from a dented thermos. She barely glanced up as I sat across from her, so I started wrapping my hands around my own mug. "How long have you been working here?" Linda shrugged. 8 years. And the stories? The ones about Gordon, the rocking chair, the humming? She finally looked at me, her face unreadable. "What about them?" I hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "They're real, aren't they?" Linda sighed and set her thermos down. "You saw him?" I nodded. She wasn't surprised. If anything, she looked relieved, like it was better that I knew. I licked my lips, choosing my words carefully. "Why this place?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why here? Why is this building like this?" Linda studied me for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. "Management doesn't tell new hires," she said. "Doesn't tell the families either. But the residents? They know." I shivered, despite the warmth of the break room. "This wasn't always a senior home," she continued. "Used to be Brookside Orphanage, closed in the 70s. I felt a slow, creeping unease coil in my stomach. "Why'd it close?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Linda's expression darkened. "Fire," she said. "Started in the basement. Nobody knows how. Place burned halfway to the ground before they put it out." I swallowed. "Did people die?" She nodded. "Children?" I whispered. Linda exhaled sharply. 9 of them. The break room suddenly felt too small, too warm. "That's why the East Wing's weird," she said. "That's where the orphanage dorms used to be." I thought about the East Wing, how it always felt colder than the rest of the building, how the motion sensors there triggered even when no one was inside. Then I thought about what Mrs. Delaney had said just 2 nights ago. That's where the little ones slept. "Can't you hear them crying at night?" I had written it off as dementia, but now I wasn't so sure. That night I paid extra attention during my rounds. When I passed the East Wing, I walked slower, listening. At first, nothing, then a faint tap, soft, rhythmic, like small fingers knocking against glass. I stopped in front of room 112, heart pounding. It had been empty since I started working here. I checked the window, expecting to see tree branches swaying outside, maybe a bird fluttering past. But the glass was covered in condensation, fogging up from the inside. And then, a shape, small, a child's handprint pressed against the glass from the inside. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The hallway was silent. No one else was there. I turned and walked away as fast as I could, refusing to look back. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the handprint on the window. I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation, condensation forming in an odd pattern, maybe an old smudge left behind, but I knew better. The glass had been cleaned before I saw it, and the print had been small, a child's. Still, I forced myself to come into work the next night, acting like everything was normal. Linda didn't ask, but I caught her watching me, as if she already knew. Everything was fine until around 2 a.m. I was at the nurse's station finishing some charts when the East Wing's motion sensor went off. I froze, my pen hovering over the paper. The security monitor flickered, displaying a grainy, black and white view of the hallway outside room 112. The camera didn't show much, just a long corridor lined with closed doors, a few pieces of furniture tucked against the walls. But something was off. At the far end of the hall where the sensor had triggered, the air looked different, almost like the static on an old TV, warping slightly before settling again. I stared at the screen, pulse pounding. The sensor blinked once more, then went still. I should have ignored it. I should have listened to the warnings, kept my head down, and stayed put. But instead, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The East Wing always felt wrong at night. It was too quiet. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. My footsteps barely made a sound against the tile. When I reached room 112, I hesitated. The door was shut just like I had left it. Then I heard it. A drip. Soft, steady, coming from inside the room. I swallowed hard and reached for the handle. The metal was cold. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room. The bed was neatly made, the bedside table bare except for an unused lamp. But the air felt damp, heavy. And then, I saw it. A puddle. Right beneath the window, where the handprint had been the night before. The water was fresh, seeping into the floor like something had been standing there, dripping. I lifted my flashlight, shining it toward the window. The condensation was back, coating the glass in a thick, misty layer. And as I watched, something formed in the fog. Help me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. And then, a sound. A soft, watery gasp, like someone struggling to breathe. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, my hands shaking as I grabbed the phone to call Linda. She answered groggily, her voice thick with sleep. Maggie? I struggled to find my voice. Room 112, She was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, You checked the records, didn't you? The words sent a fresh wave of cold through me. What? The old records, the ones they don't tell us about. I had no idea what she was talking about, but suddenly I needed to find out. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake what had happened in room 112. I knew Linda was right. There were records. Somewhere. After I got home, I barely waited for the sun to rise before heading back to Havenwood, pretending I had left something in my locker. The day staff barely glanced at me as I slipped past the main desk and down the hall toward the administration office. The records room was at the end of a quiet corridor, a small, windowless space, lined with metal filing cabinets. Most of the files were for current residents, medical histories, admission paperwork, but I wasn't looking for those. I scanned the room, my fingers trailing over old labels. Then, tucked away on the highest shelf, I found it. Brookside Orphanage. Archived records. My pulse quickened. I pulled down the first box, dust clouding the air as I opened the lid. Inside were yellowed documents, handwritten notes, old black and white photographs. Some were dated as far back as the 1940s. I flipped through quickly, scanning names and reports. Faint echoes of children's laughter seemed to linger in the stale air. My hands trembled as I dug deeper, looking for anything about the fire. And then, I found it. A faded incident report. The paper was brittle, edges singed, like it had been pulled from the fire itself. The date read November 3rd, 1968. I scanned the page, my stomach tightening with every line. Location of fire, basement, boiler room. Casualties, 9 children cause. Of death, smoke inhalation, drowning. My breath hitched. Drowning? I reread the line, my brain struggling to process it. The fire had started in the basement, but there was no mention of running water, no flooding, nothing that explained how someone could have drowned. Then I saw the name. Victim number 7, Lillian Carter, age 9. I felt the blood drain from my face. The girl in the yellow dress. I fumbled through the papers, heart hammering, until I found an old black and white photo. A group of children dressed in simple, outdated clothes, standing outside the orphanage. Some smiled, others looked uncertain, their faces frozen in time. And there, third from the left, a thin girl with dark eyes. She wore a pale yellow dress. My breath came in short gasps. Mr. Kowalski had seen her. The residents had whispered about her. And now, I was staring at her face, preserved in ink and paper for over 50 years. A chill ran through me, deep and sharp, because I suddenly knew what she had been trying to tell me. She never left. I should have left. I should have walked out of Havenwood that morning and never looked back. But I couldn't. Not after seeing Lillian's name. Not after reading how she died. She had been 9 years old. Trapped in the basement when the fire started. While the other children choked on smoke, She had drowned. In a room that had no water. I didn't know how that was possible, but I knew she was still here. So I went back for my shift that night, knowing what I had to do. The halls felt different, heavier. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long, shifting shadows against the floor. Every instinct told me to leave, but I had made a decision. At exactly 3 a.m., I made my way to room 112. The door stood slightly ajar. I hesitated, gripping my flashlight, then stepped inside. The air was damp, cold. The scent of something old and stagnant lingered. I scanned the room, my breath coming fast. Then I saw it. The window. Condensation streaked the glass, just like before. My stomach clenched as I took a step closer. A new message had formed in the fog. Downstairs. I nearly dropped the flashlight. She wasn't just haunting the room. She wanted me to go to the basement. Every rational part of my brain screamed no. But my feet were already moving. The staff basement was accessible through a locked door near the west wing. I grabbed the key from the nurse's station and made my way down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. The basement was silent, except for the hum of the old boiler. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with cleaning supplies and medical records. But then I noticed something odd. A section of the concrete floor near the back wall looked darker, like it had been replaced. I stepped closer, my pulse racing. Something was off. The air smelled wrong, earthy and damp, like wet stone. Then, a sound, a soft drip. I felt it before I saw it. Something cold touched my ankle. I gasped, jerking back. The flashlight beam wobbled as I pointed it down. Water, pooling at my feet, seeping up from a hairline crack in the floor. I staggered backward, my breath coming in fast, shallow bursts. This wasn't possible. Then, movement. The puddle rippled, like something was moving beneath it. I stumbled toward the stairs, my heart hammering, and then the whisper, a child's voice, right behind me. Help me. I ran like hell. I didn't stop until I was upstairs, until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I quit that morning, told the manager I couldn't work there anymore. Didn't bother explaining why. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up gasping, and in my dreams, I'm back in that basement, hearing the water drip, and the whisper of a little girl, still waiting, still trapped, still drowning. It started as an anniversary trip. Claire and I had been together for 6 years, married for 2, and life in London had a way of swallowing time whole. Between our jobs, her in marketing, me in finance, we barely had a moment to breathe. We needed this getaway. Just the two of us, no phones buzzing, no emails, no deadlines. Claire found Hazelwood Peaks online, a remote retreat in the Scottish Highlands. The listing promised pristine nature, unparalleled views, and total seclusion. It was exactly what we were looking for. A tiny stone cottage nestled between towering pines, with a wood-burning fireplace and a view of the valley below. The kind of place where you could forget the world existed. The drive up was long, the roads narrowing the deeper we got into the highlands. Mist clung to the hills, rolling like waves over the landscape. The damp scent of pine seeped into the car. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, my eyes flicking between the winding road and the dense fog curling through the trees. Looks like something out of a horror film, Claire murmured, peering out the window. I chuckled. Come on, you wanted an escape. This is about as off the grid as it gets. She grinned, but I noticed her tuck her coat tighter around herself. By the time we arrived at the cottage, the sun had dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cottage itself was beautiful, rustic yet well kept. A small wooden fence circled the property, and a stack of firewood was neatly piled near the door. Inside, it smelled like aged timber and something faintly floral, like dried lavender. The living room had a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. The bedroom was simple, with a heavy wooden bed frame and thick quilts that promised warmth against the Highland chill. We spent that first evening wrapped in blankets by the fire, sipping whiskey Claire had picked up at a shop along the way. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. It should have been comforting, the storm, the fire, the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the wind carried something else with it. A whisper, a hum. I told myself I was imagining things. The next morning, after a slow breakfast and several cups of coffee, we decided to explore. There were miles of trails surrounding Hazelwood Peaks, winding through the woods and up into the hills. But one name kept coming up in the guest book by the front door, Sunrise Bluff. "Look at this," Claire said, pointing to an entry from last year. "Hiked up to Sunrise Bluff. Absolutely breathtaking, but eerie. Locals don't seem to like it." I flipped through a few more pages. Similar notes. "Best view in the Highlands, but the fog feels like it's watching you. Gorgeous spot, but strange atmosphere. Horses wouldn't go near it." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Now we have to check it out." "I mean, do we?" I asked, smirking. She shot me a look. "You're telling me you're not the slightest bit curious?" I sighed, knowing there was no winning this. "All right, but let's ask the locals first. Maybe there's a reason people avoid it." That's how we ended up at the stables. Hazelwood Peaks offered horseback tours through the trails, and the stables were run by a handful of locals. The place smelled of damp hay and earth, and a few horses stood lazily in their stalls, flicking their tails. That's where we met Ewan. He was young, maybe 22, with wiry limbs and shaggy blonde hair that stuck out from under his cap. His hands were calloused, and he had a habit of chewing his bottom lip when he wasn't speaking. When we asked about Sunrise Bluff, his chewing stopped entirely. "Aye," he said, hesitating. "You don't want to go up there alone?" Claire leaned in, intrigued. "Why not?" Ewan ran a hand over the nose of a shaggy mare named Bonnie. "It's just odd up there. The horses don't like it. I've taken folks up before, but only in daylight, and even then we don't linger." "Come on," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "You don't actually believe the ghost? Stories, do you?" Ewan's gaze flicked toward the trees. "I believe what I see." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Claire, however, was undeterred. "Could you take us tomorrow morning?" Ewan hesitated, then sighed. "Aye, but we turn back if Bonnie spooks. That bluff's different at dawn." We agreed. As we walked back to the cottage, I noticed how still the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the wind, carrying something I couldn't quite name. That night, as we lay in bed, Claire scrolled through her phone, researching local legends. "Did you know they call it the Gray Lady's Bluff?" she murmured. I turned onto my side, exhausted. A Victorian woman went missing there. Elspeth something. Hiked up one morning and never came down. People say she still walks the cliffs at dawn." I exhaled sharply. "That's comforting." Claire chuckled, clicking her phone off. "I think it's fascinating." I didn't reply, because outside, beyond the cottage walls, the wind picked up. And for just a moment beneath the howling, I swore I heard something else. A woman, humming. The morning was colder than I expected. A thick mist clung to the hills, rolling in slow waves across the valley. Claire was already dressed by the time I got out of bed, tying her hair back into a loose ponytail. She looked excited, practically buzzing with energy. "You're really set on this, huh?" I muttered, rubbing my face as I sat up. She grinned. "Come on, it's an adventure. We came all this way. You're not backing out now, are you?" I sighed, throwing the blankets off. No backing out. By the time we reached the stables, Ewan was already there, saddling up Bonnie and a second horse, a dark bay named Fergus. He looked up as we approached, chewing his bottom lip again. "You sure about this?" he asked. Claire nodded. You said you've been up there before, right? Aye, he said, tightening Bonnie's reins. But like I said, we turn back if she spooks. I gave him a skeptical look. So, what exactly happens up there? Ewan hesitated, eyes flicking toward the trees. Depends who ye ask. He helped Claire, on to Bonnie, then turned to me. Some folks hear things, some see things. Others just get a bad feeling like they ain't supposed to be there. And you? I asked, climbing onto Fergus. Ewan didn't answer right away. Instead, he swung himself onto Bonnie, clicking his tongue to get her moving. Let's just get going. We followed a narrow dirt trail that twisted through the trees, the sound of hooves muffled by the damp earth. The air smelled rich and woody, pine, wet leaves, and something deeper like turned-up soil. For a while it was peaceful. The mist made everything seem softer, the trees fading into the gray like something from a painting. Claire had her phone out, snapping pictures of the scenery. Then Ewan started talking. You ever hear of the Gray Lady? He asked over his shoulder. I glanced at Claire. She had mentioned the story last night, but I figured it was just another local ghost tale. A woman went missing here, right? She said. Elspeth? Aye. Ewan shifted in the saddle. Elspeth McKinnon. She was visiting with her husband, a rich London banker. They came up here for the views, same as you. But one morning she left the cottage before sunrise. Said she wanted to see the valley in the early light. Claire shivered, adjusting her gloves. And she never came back? Ewan shook his head. Search party looked for days. Found nothing. No footprints, no clothes, not even a broken branch. She just disappeared. I scoffed. So what, people? Think she haunts the place now? Ewan gave me a sideways look. Last year, a photographer hiked up at dawn. Said he saw a woman in his camera lens wearing a gray dress. He took a picture, but right after his camera died. When he checked the film later, there was nothing there. Just mist. Claire leaned forward, intrigued. And you believe that? Ewan didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, I believe the horses. Bonnie flicked her ears, snorting at nothing. The trees thinned as we climbed higher, the mist breaking apart in wisps. The trail was steeper now, the horses slowing as they picked their way up the incline. My legs ached from the unfamiliar motion of riding, but Claire seemed unfazed, sitting, tall in the saddle. Then, Fergus twitched beneath me. I frowned, shifting my grip on the reins. The horse's ears were pointed straight ahead, his muscles tense beneath the saddle. I followed his gaze, scanning the trees. Nothing, just mist curling through the branches. Ewan slowed Bonnie, looking around carefully. Almost there. The path leveled out, opening onto a wide clearing. The ground sloped gently toward the edge of a cliff where the land dropped away into open sky. Sunrise Bluff. The view was breathtaking. The fog pooled in the valleys below, golden light spilling over the peaks as the sun rose. It painted the sky in oranges and purples, the mountains stretching endlessly beyond. Claire pulled out her phone, snapping photo after photo. This is incredible, she breathed. I had to admit it was, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt different up here, heavier. The wind moved strangely, coming in sudden bursts, then falling silent. Even the birds were quiet. Then Bonnie stopped, her ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Ewan frowned. Easy, girl. She refused to move. I glanced at Fergus. He was still, but his breathing was quick, his sides rising and falling beneath the saddle. Why is she... Claire started, but Ewan cut her off. We go, now. There was no humor in his voice, no teasing, just cold, sharp urgency. Claire hesitated, looking disappointed. Just a few more minutes? No. Ewan yanked Bonnie's reins, turning her back toward the trail. We leave, now. Fergus shifted beneath me, ears flicking wildly. I wasn't about to argue. Claire sighed, but put her phone away. As I turned Fergus, I caught one last glimpse of the view. The golden light, the endless mountains. And something else. A flicker of movement. Just beyond the mist, near the tree line. A shape. Thin. Still. Watching. My breath hitched. I blinked, and it was gone. Just mist. I swallowed hard, gripping the reins. Maybe Ewan was right. Maybe we weren't supposed to be here. We rode back in silence. The trail felt different now, narrower, more enclosed. The mist that had been light and wispy on the way up seemed heavier, clinging to the trees, curling around the horse's legs like grasping fingers. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. A shadow, a figure, something standing just beyond the fog. Ewan kept Bonnie at a steady pace, his back stiff, his jaw tight. He hadn't spoken since we left the bluff, and I wasn't about to be the one to break the silence. Claire, though, wasn't as willing to let it go. "Okay," she said, adjusting, her grip on the saddle. "Are we going to talk about what just happened?" Ewan didn't respond. Claire huffed. "Seriously?" Bonnie freaks out. "You look like you've seen a ghost, and now we're all just pretending nothing happened?" Ewan's knuckles were white on the reins. "I told you. The horses know." I let out a shaky breath. "Know what, though?" "What? Do they know?" Ewan exhaled sharply through his nose. Something was there. A chill crawled up my spine. "You saw it too." Ewan hesitated. Then quietly he said, "I." Claire turned in the saddle to look at me. "Wait, what? What did you see?" I didn't want to say it. Saying it out loud made it real. But the image was burned into my mind. That pale shape, still as stone, watching from the mist. "I don't know," I muttered. "Probably nothing. Just fog playing tricks on me." Ewan shot me a sharp look, like he knew I was lying. We kept riding. The further we got from the bluff, the calmer Bonnie seemed, though she still twitched at every snap of a twig, every rustle of wind. Then Fergus stopped. Not a slow hesitation, not a cautious pause. He stopped. Completely. My stomach tightened. "Ewan, I see it," Ewan said, already pulling Bonnie to a halt. I didn't want to look. But I did. Ahead of us. Just off the trail, something stood between the trees. A woman. She was facing away from us, her dress long and gray, blending into the fog. Not moving. Not breathing. Claire inhaled sharply. "Oh my God." I felt frozen. My fingers clenched around the reins. My mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe a trick of the light. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. Then Bonnie screamed. A sound I had never heard a horse make, high and raw, filled with terror. The woman moved. Not like a person. Not like anything natural. She twisted, her body shifting too quickly, too fluidly, like she wasn't bound by bones. And then she was facing us. Her eyes were nothing but hollow shadows, her mouth open, wide, too wide. The wind roared through the trees, and suddenly the horses were moving. Ewan didn't have to pull the reins. Bonnie bolted. Fergus followed. I barely managed to hold on, branches whipping past as we galloped down the trail, hooves pounding against the earth. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just rode. I couldn't think, couldn't process. Just hold on. The reins burned against my palms as Fergus tore down the trail, muscles bunching beneath the saddle. The wind rushed past my ears, drowning out everything but the thunder of hooves. Claire clung to Bonnie ahead of me, her body low against the horse's neck. Ewan was leading, his eyes locked straight ahead, jaw clenched. He wasn't guiding Bonnie anymore. She was running on pure instinct. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The trail behind us was swallowed by fog. For a split second I thought we were safe, that maybe we had left her behind, that maybe whatever had been standing in the trees wasn't real. Then I saw movement, not running, not chasing, gliding. She was keeping pace with us, moving through the mist without touching the ground. The gray of her dress blended into the swirling fog, her shape barely distinguishable except for her face. Her mouth, still open too wide, moved, as if screaming, but no sound came. The silence was worse. I yanked on Fergus's reins, urging him faster. Go, go, go! The path twisted sharply, and Fergus nearly skidded, his hooves kicking up loose dirt. I gritted my teeth, bracing as he adjusted his stride. The trees became a blur. Ahead I saw it, the break in the woods, the clearing where the stables sat. We were close. Ewan must have seen it too, because he leaned forward, whispering something, to Bonnie. The mare pushed harder, hooves churning, and then we broke through the tree line. The shift was instant. The moment our horses crossed into the clearing, the weight in the air lifted. It was like stepping out of deep water. The fog didn't follow. It curled at the edge of the woods, lingering as if it couldn't leave. Bonnie stumbled to a stop, her sides heaving. Fergus followed, nearly tossing me forward with the sudden halt. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the horses, the distant rustling of trees. Claire was shaking. She slid off Bonnie, her legs nearly giving out as she touched the ground. I jumped down after her, grabbing her shoulders. You okay? My voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. She nodded quickly, but I could feel the tremor in her body. Ewan was still in the saddle, staring back at the trail we had just fled. His hands were locked around the reins, knuckles pale. I turned, to look too. The trees stood silent, their dark forms stretching into the mist. The fog was still there, hovering at the edge like a living thing. But she was gone. Or maybe she had never left. Ewan exhaled, the sound shaky. He swung himself off Bonnie, giving her a quick pat, then turned to us. You saw her, he said. It wasn't a question. Neither Claire nor I answered. We didn't need to. Ewan nodded slowly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, She doesn't leave the bluff. I swallowed hard. But we weren't at the bluff anymore. Ewan's eyes darkened. He turned back toward the trees, watching. The fog shift between the trunks. She followed us. We didn't speak much after that. Ewan led Bonnie and Fergus back to the stables in silence, his movement stiff, mechanical. Claire walked beside me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the morning chill fading into the afternoon. I could still feel my pulse hammering, in my throat, the sound of hooves pounding against the dirt echoing in my ears. Inside the stables, the air was thick with the smell of hay and damp leather. Ewan unsaddled the horses with quick, practiced hands, but I noticed how his fingers trembled as he worked. Claire sat on a bale of hay, staring down at the phone in her hands, her face pale. She hadn't said a word since we got back. I crouched beside her. Hey, I said gently. Talk to me. She didn't look up. Instead, she turned her phone toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a photo, one of the last ones she had taken at the bluff. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the fog rolling over the hills like an ocean. But in the center of the frame, just beyond where the trees began, a streak of mist. Only it wasn't just mist. It had shape. A long, outstretched arm, fingers reaching, a woman's hand. The edges of the figure blurred, but the more I stared, the clearer it became. The faint curve of a shoulder, the suggestion of a hollow face barely distinguishable from the fog surrounding it. I felt a cold pressure in my chest, like the air had been sucked from the room. This wasn't there, Claire whispered. I could hear the slight shake in her voice. Ewan finally turned toward us, wiping, his hands on his jeans. He took one look at the screen and blanched. That's her, he muttered. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to say it was a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, something, anything other than what it looked like. But I couldn't. I had seen her. Claire had seen her. The horses had felt her. A heavy silence settled over us, pressing in like the fog had on the trail. I licked my dry lips and forced out the question clawing at the back of my mind. What happens now? Ewan hesitated. You don't go back, that's all? His voice was firm, but his fingers twitched where they rested on his knee. Claire locked the phone, slipping it into her pocket. "You mean no one ever tries?" Ewan exhaled through his nose. "Some do." His eyes flicked toward the woods, toward the place where the fog still lingered in the distance. "They don't always come back." A chill passed over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ewan straightened, suddenly restless. "You should go," he said. "You're leaving tomorrow anyway, I nodded slowly. "Then, go, pack up, don't talk about it, just go." Claire and I exchanged a glance. We didn't argue. We left the stables without another word. That night, back at the cottage, we packed in near silence. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes. At one point, Claire stopped, her hands frozen mid-motion over her suitcase. I looked up. "What is it?" She didn't answer, at first. Then, slowly, she turned toward the door. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I stood still, listening. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind howled outside, the floor creaked faintly beneath our weight. Then, the clop of hooves, faint, just beyond the cottage walls. A shiver crawled up my spine. "There aren't any horses out there," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. Claire swallowed hard. "I know." Neither of us moved. We didn't check the window. We didn't look outside. We just waited, breath held, as the hooves slowly faded into the distance. The next morning we left before sunrise. We never went back to Hazelwood Peaks. But sometimes when the wind howls just right, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, Claire swears she hears something else hidden beneath it, a woman's voice, humming. When I was 17, I got my first real job at McDonald's. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me some spending money and a sense of independence. I had just started my senior year of high school, and like most kids my age, I was eager to have some cash for gas, fast food, and the occasional trip to the mall. McDonald's wasn't a bad place to work, at least not at first. The smell of fryer oil clung to my clothes, and my feet ached after every shift, but I got used to it. My manager, an older guy named Rick, ran a tight ship. He wasn't the friendliest, but as long as you did your job, he left you alone. My coworkers were a mix of high school kids like me, college students trying to make rent, and a few adults who had been there for years. I mostly worked evening shifts, clocking in around 4 and staying until close at 11. Those shifts were usually busy, but once the dinner rush died down, we'd joke around while restocking supplies and cleaning. It wasn't the kind of job you dreamed about, but it wasn't the worst either. After a few weeks, I had settled into a routine. I'd take orders at the register, clean tables, refill the drink station, and sometimes work the drive-thru, the kai. People I worked with were nice enough. And I even started talking more with a guy named Mark, who was a year ahead of me in school. Then one night I met Joe. Joe wasn't like the other employees. For one, I had never actually seen him working before. I was in the back wiping down trays when he walked in. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a black hoodie and jeans. He was tall and lanky, with dark circles under his eyes and shaggy brown hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. "Hey," he said, grinning at me like we were old friends. Hey," I replied, unsure if he was a new hire or someone I just hadn't noticed before. "Name's Joe," he said, sticking out his hand. I shook it, but something about him felt off. His grip was cold and limp, like he wasn't really trying. "I work here too," he added. "Been here a while, but I mostly do the late shifts." I nodded. It wasn't unusual for employees to have different schedules, so I figured that's why I hadn't seen him before. But there was something about him that put me on edge. Maybe it was the way he stared a little too long or how he didn't blink enough. That night I didn't think much of it. I finished my shift, clocked out, and drove home. But Joe wasn't someone I would forget easily. A few nights later, I was taking out the trash when I saw Joe again. This time, he was in uniform, standing near the dumpsters smoking a cigarette. "Hey man," he called out. I nodded at him and tossed the trash bag into the dumpster. "You get used to it here?" he asked, exhaling a stream of smoke. "I guess," I said. "It's just a job." Joe chuckled. "Yeah, just a job." He flicked his cigarette onto the pavement and stomped it out. Then, before I could walk away, he said, "You drive, right?" "Yeah," I answered hesitantly. "Cool. Hey, you think you could give me a ride home after your shift?" I hesitated. I barely knew the guy, and something about him rubbed me the wrong way. But I didn't want to be rude. Sure, I guess," I said. "Where do you live?" "Not far," he said, his grin widening. "I'll be out front when you're done." That night, I finished my shift, grabbed my things, and walked to my car. Joe was waiting outside, just like he said he would be. But something didn't add up. I hadn't seen him working at all that night. I had been in the kitchen at the register taking out the trash, and not once did I see Joe on the clock. He hadn't been behind the grill or at the drive-thru, but somehow he was still there waiting for a ride. "You ready?" he asked, stepping toward my car. My gut told me to say no, to make up an excuse. But I had already agreed, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. "Yeah," I said, unlocking the doors. Joe slid into the passenger seat and I started the engine. I didn't know it then, but that was the first mistake I made. I pulled out of the McDonald's parking lot, glancing at Joe out of the corner of my eye. He sat in the passenger seat, slouched with his hands tucked into the front pocket of his hoodie. He hadn't said much since getting in, just a simple, "Thanks, man," before falling into silence. I was already regretting this. "So, where do you live?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Joe scratched at his chin. "You know the gas station on 5th? "Yeah. Turn left there. I'm a few blocks down." 5th Street wasn't far. Maybe a 5-minute drive from McDonald's. That made me feel a little better. At least I wouldn't be stuck in the car with him for long. The radio played softly, filling the awkward silence between us. Normally, I didn't mind driving at night. I liked the quiet, the way the streets emptied out, the neon glow of the fast food signs blurring as I passed. But tonight, something felt different. Joe didn't make small talk. He didn't check his phone or mess with the radio. He just stared out the window, watching the dark streets roll by. I told myself I was overthinking it, but my hand still gripped the wheel a little tighter. We reached 5th Street, and I slowed down looking for the gas station. The lights inside were dim, and a single car was parked at one of the pumps. I flicked on my turn signal. "Not here," Joe said. I hesitated. "I thought you said, keep going." "Couple more blocks." I pressed down on the gas. The farther we got from the main road, the quieter it became. Most of the houses on this street were old, the kind with sagging porches and peeling paint. A few porch lights flickered, but most of the homes were dark. After 2 blocks, Joe finally spoke. "Right here." I pulled over in front of a small, run-down house. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown with weeds. There was no car in the driveway, no sign of life at all. "You sure?" I asked. Joe turned to me and smiled. "Yeah, thanks for the ride." He opened the door, but before stepping out, he paused. "Hey, you ever need anything, let me know." I forced a tight smile. "Sure, man." Joe chuckled, then shut the door. I watched as he walked up the cracked driveway, disappearing into the shadows of the porch. I waited for a second, expecting to see a light turn on inside the house, but nothing happened. The place stayed dark. A weird feeling crawled up my spine. I didn't want to sit there any longer. I shifted into drive and pulled away, checking my rearview mirror. Joe was gone. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. Maybe he just lived alone. Maybe he didn't turn on the lights because he didn't want to wake anyone. But something about that house had felt wrong. I shook it off, went inside, and crashed into bed. I had school in the morning, and the last thing I needed was to lose sleep over some weird guy from work. A week passed, and I barely thought about Joe. He wasn't on the schedule, and no one really mentioned him. It was like he had just disappeared. Then, one night, I was walking to my car after my shift when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Joe's car. It was parked in the corner of the lot, away from the other cars. A beat-up, dark green sedan with rust along the edges. The same one I had seen him driving before, but Joe wasn't there. I glanced around, half expecting him to step out of the shadows. The parking lot was nearly empty. Mark was getting into his truck a few spots away, but other than that, I was alone. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe Joe had come by to pick something up. Maybe someone else had borrowed his car. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my neck. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the main road, I kept checking my mirror, half expecting to see that green sedan following me. At first, everything seemed normal. The streets were quiet, and the stoplights glowed red and green against the empty roads. But then a few blocks from my house, my stomach dropped. Headlights. Too far back to be obvious, but close enough that I noticed. A car, dark and nondescript, moving at the same steady pace as me. I turned onto my street. So did the car. My hands tightened on the wheel. My driveway was just ahead, but suddenly I didn't want to pull in. If someone was following me, I didn't want them to know where I lived. Instead, I drove past my house and kept going. My heart pounded in my chest as I made another turn, then another. The headlights stayed with me. I was being followed. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I gritted my teeth and made a quick decision. I turned into a gas station parking lot and pulled up beside the building, where I had a clear view of the road. Seconds later, the car passed. It didn't slow down, it just kept going, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It had to be a coincidence, right? Just some random car taking the same route? But deep down, I knew. Joe didn't live in my neighborhood. So why had he followed me home? I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those headlights trailing behind me, steady and unrelenting. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I dragged myself out of bed, exhausted. School felt like a blur, just hours of going through the motions. I barely paid attention in class, and by lunchtime, Mark noticed something was off. "Dude, you good?" he asked, shoving a handful of fries into his mouth. I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone about Joe. It felt ridiculous, like I was being paranoid over nothing. But at the same time, I needed to say it out loud. "You remember that guy Joe?" I asked. Mark frowned, thinking for a second. "Tall dude?" "Always. Looked kinda strung out." "Yeah." "What about him?" I hesitated, then lowered my voice. "He asked me for a ride home last week, but I never saw him working that night. Then a few days later, I saw his car in the lot, but he wasn't there. And last night, I think he followed me home." Mark stopped chewing. "Wait, you're serious?" I nodded. He wiped his hands on a napkin, looking concerned. "That's weird, man. You told anyone else?" I shook my head. Mark sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Look, maybe it's nothing, but if it happens again, you should tell someone, like Rick or even the cops if it gets bad." I nodded, but deep down I didn't think I'd do either. I wasn't the type to go running to authority over a hunch. Still, Mark's reaction made me feel a little less crazy. I tried to push it out of my mind, but later that night, while I was on my break at work, my phone buzzed. A text. "Joe, hey, man, can you give me a ride to work tomorrow?" My stomach twisted. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the screen. He wasn't even supposed to be working, at least not as far as I knew. And after last night, the last thing I wanted was to be alone in a car with him again. I switched over to our work group chat and fired off a quick message. "Me. Is Joe on the schedule tomorrow?" A minute later, one of the other guys, Kenny, responded. "Kenny, nah man, Joe got fired like a week ago." My breath caught in my throat. "Fired?" Me, "Wait, what?" Kenny, "Yeah, he got into it with Rick, like bad. Almost fought him. He's not allowed back." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Joe didn't work here anymore. He had no reason to be texting me. No reason to be asking for a ride to a place he wasn't even allowed to go. I didn't respond. Instead, I went straight to my contacts, pulled up Joe's number, and blocked it. I told myself that was the end of it. I was wrong. Blocking Joe's number should have been the end of it. I told myself that over and over, trying to convince myself it was all just some weird misunderstanding. Maybe Joe didn't know he'd been fired yet. Maybe he just wanted a ride and didn't mean anything by it. But something about it didn't sit right. I kept thinking about that night he had asked me for a ride, how I never once saw him actually working that shift. I thought about his car sitting in the parking lot days later, with no sign of him anywhere. And most of all, I thought about the headlights following me home. Even though I had blocked his number, I still felt uneasy. I started parking closer to the entrance at work, making sure I wasn't alone when I walked to my car. If I closed, I'd wait for Mark or one of the other guys so we could leave together. I even started varying my route home just in case. For a while, nothing happened. And then, a week later, I saw him again. It was a slow Tuesday night, and I was taking trash out to the dumpster behind the building. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of cars belonging to the night shift crew. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me and I took a deep breath, glad to be out of the greasy, fluorescent-lit kitchen for a minute. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from behind the dumpster. I froze, my grip tightening on the trash bag. "Hey, man." I nearly dropped the bag. Joe stepped out from behind the dumpster, hands in his hoodie pocket, that same eerie grin stretched across his face. His eyes looked hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. For a second, I couldn't move. My brain struggled to catch up, to make sense of why he was here. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the restaurant. What are you doing here?" I finally managed to ask. Joe shrugged. "Just wanted to talk." My pulse was hammering in my ears. "Dude, you're not supposed to be here. You got fired." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, Rick was being a real asshole about that." I took a step back, keeping my distance. The back door was only a few feet away. If I needed to, I could run inside. Joe tilted his head, watching me carefully. "Why'd you block my number?" My mouth went dry. He knew. I just didn't think it was a good idea to keep talking. Since you don't work here anymore." Joe's smile didn't fade, but something in his expression changed. It was subtle, but suddenly the air felt heavier. He said slowly, "I thought we were cool, thought we had an understanding." I forced out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, man, no hard feelings. Before I could finish, the back door swung open behind me and Mark stepped outside. "Yo, you good?" I had never been so relieved to see someone in my life. Joe's smile finally faded. He glanced at Mark, then back at me. "Yeah," he muttered. "We're good." Without another word, he turned and walked off, disappearing into the shadows behind the dumpster. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I had been holding it. Mark frowned. "What the hell was that about?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I think Joe's got unfinished business." After that night behind the dumpster, I couldn't shake the feeling that Joe wasn't done with me. He had walked away, but something in the way he stared at me, like he was waiting for something, stuck in my head. I started watching my back more than ever. I parked under the brightest streetlights at work, double-checked my locks before going to bed, and even switched up my routine so I wasn't taking the same roads home every night. For a while, nothing happened. But then, one Friday night, I closed up with Mark. We walked out to the parking lot together, laughing about something stupid that happened during the shift. The tension from the past couple of weeks had finally started to fade. Then I saw it. The green sedan. It was parked across the street, just barely visible under the glow of a flickering streetlight. I felt my stomach drop. Joe. Mark must have seen my face change because he followed my gaze. "Dude," he muttered. "Is that—" "I don't know," I said quickly, even though I did. We stood there for a second, neither of us moving. The car just sat there, Engine off, no movement inside. Then, the driver's side door opened. Joe stepped out. He didn't say anything, didn't wave or try to approach us. He just stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, staring. That was it for me. "Get in your car," I muttered to Mark. "You sure?" "Just go." I didn't wait to see if he listened. I practically sprinted to my car, locked the doors the second I was inside, and turned the key in the ignition. Joe still hadn't moved. I backed out of the parking spot, eyes locked on him the whole time. As I pulled onto the road, my hands were shaking against the wheel. In my mirror, I saw the green sedan's headlights flick on. Not again. I pressed down on the gas, taking a sharp right at the next intersection. I wasn't going home, not if he was following me. I took another turn, then another, but the headlights stayed with me. My heart was racing now. This wasn't some coincidence. He wasn't just running errands or heading in the same direction. He was following me. I wasn't about to lead him to my house. Instead, I made a split-second decision and turned into a gas station parking lot, the same one I had pulled into that night weeks ago, but this time Joe didn't drive past. He pulled in right behind me. I gripped the wheel, my breath coming fast. There were a few people inside the gas station, a guy filling up his truck at the pump. At least I wasn't alone. Joe's car idled, behind mine, the headlights still shining into my rearview mirror. Then slowly he stepped out. I didn't move. He walked toward my driver's side window, his face hidden in the shadows. For a second I thought about rolling the window down, asking him what the hell he wanted, but I didn't. Instead I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Joe must have seen me do it because he stopped mid-step. He stood there for a moment, just staring. Then without a word he turned around, got back into his car, and drove off. I didn't go straight home that night. I sat in that gas station parking lot for a long time, my heart still pounding. Joe never came back to McDonald's. His car never showed up in the lot again, and he never tried to contact me after that night. I never found out what he wanted. I never wanted to. It was 2:06 a.m. on October 17th, a night like any other. I was in the middle of a marathon study session for the SATs, trying to convince myself that knowing obscure vocabulary words would somehow secure my future. The glow of my laptop screen painted my bedroom in a dull blue haze, and my brain buzzed with too much caffeine. I pushed my chair back, stretching my legs. My room, the second one on the left at the top of the stairs, had the best view of the backyard. The old swing set, rusted and lopsided, stood in the corner near the trees. My dad never took it down, and I never asked why. Something made me pause. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, I wasn't imagining. And through the sliding glass door in the kitchen, past the overgrown grass and the forgotten swing set, she stood there. A woman. She was barefoot, standing in the drizzle, her toes sinking into the cold, damp earth. Her nightgown, once white, was now stained yellowish, clinging to her thin frame like old wallpaper peeling from the walls. Long, stringy brown hair obscured most of her face, but I could still make out her features. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, and scratches, deep, angry gashes running down both arms, as if she had clawed her way out of something. I couldn't move. The longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. Her head tilted, not at a natural angle, but precisely where our security camera's blind spot began. As if she knew. Then she spoke, not out loud. Her lips moved silently, forming 3 distinct words. "You see me now." A chill climbed up my spine, spreading through my limbs like ice. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second I considered waking my dad. But what would I even say? "Hey, Dad, there's a barefoot woman in our yard, and I think she might be a ghost." Instead, I blinked, just once, and she was gone. The next morning, I barely touched my breakfast. My dad, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, was buried in an old case file, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. He always worked best in the mornings, before the station, before the world demanded too much from him. I cleared my throat. Hey, Dad. Hmm? There was someone in our backyard last night. That got his attention. His head snapped up, eyes sharp. What do you mean, someone? I hesitated. A woman. She was standing near the swing set, looked off. He set his mug down. You call the cops? No, she was gone before I could. Dad's expression darkened. You get a good look at her? I nodded. Kinda. She had long hair, scratches all over her arms. She was barefoot. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. I followed, suddenly feeling ridiculous. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. The yard was still damp from last night's rain. The swing set creaked slightly in the breeze. Everything looked normal, except for 3 cigarette butts near the tree line. My dad crouched, picking one up with a gloved hand. You don't smoke. I shook my head. He exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the bushes. Looks like someone's been standing out here for a while. I swallowed hard. Then we found the hair clip. It was small, pink, and plastic, the kind a little kid would wear. I turned it over in my fingers, a knot tightening in my stomach. I thought you said the woman was alone, Dad said. She was. We both stood there in silence. The cold air pressed against my skin, making the hair on my arms stand up. Something wasn't right. Then my dad muttered something under his breath. I barely caught it, but it sounded like, not again. That night, after dinner, my dad pulled up the security footage from the night before. I sat beside him in his home office, watching as the black and white feed played on his laptop. 2:05 a.m. The backyard was empty. 2:06 a.m. Static. The screen glitched, just for a second, but when the image returned, the woman was there, standing, perfectly still. My breath hitched. The camera hadn't caught her approaching. No movement, no transition. One frame, she was gone. The next, she was just there. Then, at 2:07 a.m., the camera glitched again. When it cleared, she was gone. I felt my dad shift beside me. His jaw was tight, fingers tapping against his knee. This happened before, didn't it? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he minimized the video and opened an old folder on his desktop. I glimpsed the title, Hendricks Family, Missing Persons 1992. He clicked a file revealing a grainy, scanned photograph. A family of 3, 2 parents and a little girl, no older than 6, standing in front of a familiar-looking swing set. Our swing set. And in the corner of the photo, blurred but unmistakable, stood a woman in a faded floral nightgown. I gripped the edge of the desk. Dad? His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. The Hendricks family disappeared from this house 30 years ago, he said, and the security system glitched that night too. I didn't know what to say. The walls of our home felt suddenly smaller, like they were closing in. Then, I thought about what she said to me. You see me now. She wasn't just some ghost lurking in the backyard. She wanted to be seen. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. My history teacher droned on about something to do with the Cold War, but all I could think about was the woman in the backyard, the way she looked right at me, the way my dad reacted when he saw the footage, the Hendricks family. By lunchtime, I'd made up my mind. I needed to know more. When the final bell rang, I ignored the usual chatter of students rushing out and made my way to the library instead. The school's archives were old, a dusty collection of microfilm and aging newspapers. It was a long shot, but I figured if an entire family went missing from my house, someone must have written about it. After about 20 minutes of scrolling through old headlines, I found it. Family of 3. Mysteriously vanishes from Orchard. Lane Home, 1992. The article was short, just a few paragraphs, but my stomach twisted as I read. On the night of October 17, 1992, David and Laura Hendricks, along with their 6-year-old daughter Lisa, were reported missing from their home on Orchard Lane. Police found no signs of forced entry, no struggle. The family's car remained in the driveway, their valuables untouched. The only clue left behind was the security system, which had inexplicably malfunctioned between 2:05 and 2:07 a.m., the exact time authorities believe they disappeared. Detective Mark Mitchell, then a young officer with the Rochester PD, was one of the first on the scene. My breath caught in my throat. Dad was there that night? I read on, trying to ignore the way my hands were suddenly shaking. Authorities initially suspected a voluntary disappearance, but no financial transactions, phone records, or travel logs suggested the family ever planned to leave. Despite multiple searches, no trace of the Hendricks family was ever found. The Yamper case remains open. I stared at the screen. The date at the top of the page was exactly 30 years ago to the night I saw the woman. I needed to talk to my dad. The house felt different when I got home. It wasn't anything obvious, just this weird, heavy silence that settled in the air. The kind that made you feel like someone was standing just out of sight. I found my dad in his office, hunched over his desk, flipping through an old file. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and I could see the deep lines in his forehead. He looked older than usual. "I found the article," I said. He didn't look up. "I figured you would." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "You were there the night the Hendricks disappeared." This time he did look at me. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. "Yeah. You never told me. You never asked." That pissed me off. "Dad, come on. This isn't just some random missing person case. These people lived here, in our house." He sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then finally he spoke. "I was fresh on the force, only been a cop for a year when it happened. Got the call around 6 a.m. from a neighbor who noticed the Hendricks front door was wide open. No answer when they knocked. No movement inside. Just silence." I swallowed hard. I could picture it. The early morning light spilling into the abandoned house, the eerie stillness of a home that should have been full of life. Me and my partner, Officer Jensen, responded first. We went in thinking maybe it was a break-in or maybe David Hendricks had a stroke or something, but the second we stepped inside, we knew something was wrong. I waited, my pulse hammering. The table was set for dinner. 3 plates, half-eaten food, glasses still full. Like they had just gotten up in the middle of their meal and walked away. A chill crept down my spine. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing out of place except... His voice trailed off, and for the first time since I started this conversation, I saw something close to fear in my dad's eyes. "Except what?" I pressed. He hesitated. "Lisa's room. The bed was unmade like she'd been in it, but the window was open. Just a crack. And on the windowsill we found..." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We found small scratch marks, like someone had been clawing at it." I shivered. "The security system glitched that night, just like it did for us," I said. "Yeah," I let that sink in. "Dad," I said slowly, "who was the woman I saw?" His expression darkened. "I don't know." But I could tell he wasn't being completely honest. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the article, about Lisa's window, about the scratches, about the woman in the backyard. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the glow of my alarm clock casting eerie shadows along the walls. Then at exactly 2:06 a.m. I heard it. A creak. Not loud, not obvious. Just the faintest shift of weight on an old wooden floorboard. I froze. It came from the hallway. Holding my breath, I turned my head toward the door. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the open door frame. Another creak. Closer. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. My bedroom window was locked. My dad was asleep. I should have been the only one awake. Then just beyond the threshold of my door, something moved. Not a full figure, just the barest hint of motion, a flicker of white. And then I heard it. Low, raspy, barely above a whisper. We lived in your room too. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The hallway went silent again, but I could feel something standing there, watching, waiting. And then, just like before, it was gone. The next morning, I didn't tell my dad what happened. I wanted to. I wanted to march straight into the kitchen and tell him that I'd heard her again, that she had spoken to me, that she had been inside the house. But I didn't. Because the look on his face when he saw that security footage told me he already knew. Instead, I went through the motions, ate my cereal, nodded along as he rattled off the usual dad things. Lock the doors when you get home, don't speed on the way to school, don't forget about your SAT prep. But I wasn't listening. All I could think about was that voice. We lived in your room too. What did that mean? I made it through the school day in a fog, barely registering anything my teacher said. At lunch, I sat alone, scrolling through old articles about the Hendricks case on my phone. There wasn't much, just the same recycled story about how they vanished without a trace. But then, buried deep in the archives of a true crime blog, I found something new. Retired officer speaks on Rochester's coldest case. I clicked on it. The article was from 2018, an interview with a retired cop named George Jensen, my dad's old partner. Most of it was standard. How the case haunted him, how it made no sense, how he still lost sleep thinking about the little girl who disappeared that night. But then, at the bottom, one paragraph stood out. I don't know what happened to the Hendricks family, Jensen admitted, but I'll tell you this. Mark Mitchell was the first officer on the scene that morning. And something about the way he acted, I don't know. It was like he wasn't surprised, like he'd seen it before. My stomach turned. I scrolled further, searching for something, anything, to make sense of what I'd just read. And then I saw it, a blurry old crime scene photo. It showed my house, our backyard to be specific, the swing set, the overgrown grass, and in the foreground a police officer's back was turned to the camera, his badge number just barely visible. 293. I frowned, something tugging at the back of my memory. Why did that number seem familiar? And then it hit me. I'd seen it before, on the man at the 7-Eleven, the one I saw walking with the woman in the nightgown, the man in the Rochester PD windbreaker. I dug my phone out of my pocket, my hands suddenly clammy as I scrolled through my notes app where I had written it down that night. 293. The same number. I swallowed hard. Jensen had retired in 2002. That meant Taiwan 293 shouldn't have been active anymore. But I'd seen it. I'd seen him, walking down the street, clear as day, with her. I locked my phone, shoving it into my pocket like that would somehow make it go away. My pulse hammered in my ears. I needed to talk to my dad. He wasn't in his office when I got home. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I checked the kitchen, the living room. Nothing. Then I heard the muffled sound of his voice from the basement. I hesitated. We didn't go down there much. It was mostly storage, old case files, Christmas decorations, things we never used but never threw away. I made my way to the basement door, pausing at the top of the steps. Doesn't make sense, my dad was saying. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want to be overheard. No forced entry, no footprints in the mud, but the hair clip. A pause. I know, but it's the same pattern. Every time. I frowned. He was on the phone. Carefully, I crept down the stairs, pressing myself against the shadows. 30 years, he muttered. Why now? Another pause. Then his voice lowered even further. Ryan saw her. A cold prickle ran down my spine. I don't know what she wants, he continued. But it's not over. I didn't hear the rest. Because at that moment, something creaked behind. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart leapt into my throat. But there was nothing there. Just the empty basement stairs. And then, from upstairs, I heard the sound of the sliding glass door. The backyard. I bolted up the steps, 2 at a time, my breath coming fast and shallow. I skidded into the kitchen, eyes immediately locking onto the glass door. It was open, just an inch. Cold night air seeped in through the gap. And outside, standing by the swing set, was the woman. Her nightgown clung to her thin frame, damp and clinging, the mildew smell almost reaching me even from here. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but I could see the scratches again. Fresh. Deep. She had been clawing at something. She lifted her head. And for the first time I saw her eyes. They were wrong. Dark and hollow like 2 pits in her face. And yet I felt them pulling at me. Like if I stared too long I'd get lost in them. My mouth was dry, my legs locked in place. Then slowly she lifted one arm and pointed. Not at me. At the house. At my room. And then, in the faintest whisper, I heard her speak again. We never left. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. And just like before, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I locked the sliding glass door and pulled the curtain shut. But it didn't make a difference. I could still feel her out there. She had pointed at my room. What did that mean? We never left. Did she mean the Hendricks family? The house, or something worse? I stood there, gripping the door handle, trying to slow my breathing. I needed answers. And if my dad wasn't going to tell me, I'd find them myself. I turned away from the door and made my way back to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight as I moved, carefully listening. My dad had gone quiet. Was he still down here? The low hum of the dehumidifier filled the space, but otherwise the basement was still. Dim light from a single hanging bulb cast long shadows over the shelves, packed tight with old boxes. Some were labeled Christmas, camping gear, Ryan's baby stuff. But my eyes went straight to the unlabeled ones in the corner. Dad's old case files. I hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. He would lose his mind if he caught me down here. But that article from Jensen stuck in my head. Mitchell was the first officer on the scene, and he wasn't surprised. What did he know? I crouched beside the boxes, running my fingers over the lids. The dust made my hands dirty almost instantly. Some of these files hadn't been touched in years. But then I noticed something. One of the boxes was clean. No dust, no cobwebs, like it had been moved recently. I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of old folders, yellowing from age. Some were thick, filled with reports and handwritten notes. Others were thinner, holding only a few pages. And then I saw it. A folder labeled Hendricks. My stomach tightened. I reached for it, my hands shaking slightly. The paper inside was crisp, newer than the rest. I flipped it open and scanned the first page. Case file 924763, missing persons report. Hendricks family, date filed October 17th, 1992. Reporting officer Mark E. Mitchell. I swallowed hard. My dad had written this. I kept reading. Initial report filed at 6:23 a.m. Neighbor, Mrs. Ellen Garcia, reported front door open. No response from inside. Officers arrived on scene at 6:42 a.m. No signs of forced entry. Security system malfunction. Logged at 2:06 a.m. House undisturbed except for one open window in child's bedroom. I flipped to the next page. It was a list of items recovered from the scene. 3 plates with partially eaten food. Child stuffed rabbit found on floor beside bed, window screen pushed outward. No fingerprints found. Unidentified set of footprints near backyard swing set. That made me pause. Unidentified? I flipped another page, my heartbeat quickening. There was a photograph stapled to the report. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough. It showed the ground near the swing set. And there, imprinted in the dirt, were 2 sets of footprints, one small, a child's, the other barefoot. I clenched my jaw, my skin prickling. I thought about the woman's feet, bare, cold, sinking into the damp grass. Was this hers? I kept reading. The last page was a handwritten note from my dad. His writing was tight, controlled, but at the bottom, the last few sentences were shaky. like his hand had trembled while writing them. October 20th, 1992. Additional notes. No new leads. No sign of Hendrick's family. House remains empty. One thing I can't shake. Talk to neighbor again. She swears she saw a woman outside the house the night they disappeared. Long hair. Nightgown. Thought it was Laura Hendricks at first, but then she said something strange. She said the woman was standing in the yard, not moving, not speaking, just watching. She said it felt like she was waiting for someone to notice her. My mouth went dry. I shut the folder, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just a ghost story. This had happened before. 30 years ago, someone else had seen her, and now, she was back. I shoved the file back into the box and replaced, the lid wiping the dust off my hands. My mind raced. Why had my dad never told me this? Why had he buried the file down here instead of keeping it with the rest of his active cases? And most importantly, why did the woman come back now? I turned toward the stairs, my legs stiff as I climbed back up. I needed to talk to him. I needed to ask him outright what he knew. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped, because something was different. My bedroom door was open. I hadn't left it open. Slowly, I stepped toward it, my pulse pounding. The air in the house felt thick, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. I pushed the door open wider. Everything looked normal, until I saw my desk. My SAT prep book was still open where I left it, but something was sitting on top of it. Something that wasn't there before. A Polaroid. The edges were curled, the color slightly faded. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was a picture of my room, taken from inside my room, but that wasn't the worst part. In the bottom left corner, blurred but unmistakable, the woman, standing in the doorway, watching me. I dropped the photo. My breath hitched, my hands clenched into fists. Enough. I turned on my heel, marching toward the front door. I didn't care if my dad wanted to talk about it or not. I was going to the police station. I was going to find someone who could tell me what the hell was happening. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sound stopped me cold. Not a whisper, not a footstep, a soft, deliberate click, the lock. The door had just locked by itself. The lock clicked, sharp and deliberate. I jerked my hand away from the doorknob like it had burned me. The house was silent. Too silent. Even the low hum of the fridge seemed distant, like the air itself had thickened, muffling the world around me. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. The living room was still, the furniture undisturbed. The curtains over the sliding glass door remained drawn, but I knew what was outside. I wasn't alone. My breath was coming too fast, too shallow. I needed to find my dad, now. I took a step toward the hallway, then stopped. A sound echoed from upstairs. A single deliberate creak. The top stair. My skin went cold. Someone was up there. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, my legs stiff like they didn't want to obey. My dad's office was down the hall, the door slightly ajar. I reached it in seconds, pushing inside without knocking. He was at his desk, hunched over his laptop, rubbing his temple like he had a headache. He barely looked up. "Dad," my voice came out hoarse. He sighed. "Not now, Ryan." I didn't care. I stepped forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "She's inside." That made him look up. "What?" I saw her again. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. She left a Polaroid in my room. And then the front door locked on its own. I hesitated, then added, "Someone's upstairs." His face changed. His usual cop calm cracked, just for a second. Then he was up, moving fast. He grabbed the gun from his desk drawer, checking the safety before stepping past me into the hall. I followed. The house felt different now. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my chest. We moved toward the staircase, my dad's footsteps slow and deliberate. I stayed just behind him, every muscle in my body tense. The stairs stretched, up into darkness. Then, another creak. Halfway up this time, someone was moving. My dad raised the gun, his voice low and steady. "Who's there?" Silence. He took the first step, then the second. I stayed behind, barely breathing. We reached the top landing where the hallway split, left to my room right to the bathroom. The air was freezing. Dad swept the gun toward my door and nudged it open with his foot. Empty. The bathroom door was already open, also empty. The house was still. And then, from downstairs, the sound of the sliding glass door gliding open. I spun so fast I nearly lost my balance. "That's not possible," I whispered. We had locked it. I had locked it. My dad didn't hesitate. He turned and took the stairs 2 at a time, gun still raised. I followed, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. We reached the kitchen just in time to see the curtain shifting. A faint breeze crept in through the open door. But she wasn't there. Just the night. Just the empty backyard. My dad stepped outside, scanning the area with quick, practiced movements. I stayed by the door, my pulse slamming in my ears. The swing set creaked in the wind. The grass was undisturbed. There were no footprints. She was gone. Dad lowered the gun, exhaling sharply. He turned back to me, his face unreadable. "Get inside." I didn't argue. We locked everything. Every door. Every window. We checked the security system, but there was nothing. No malfunctions this time, no unexplained glitches, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. And my dad knew too. He didn't say much, just poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. I sat across from him, waiting. Finally, I broke the silence. "What happened that night?" I asked. He didn't look at me, just swirled the glass in his hands. "The Hendricks," I pressed, a long pause, then finally, "They never left." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "There was something off about that case, from the beginning." He shook his head. "We searched for weeks, every lead, every possibility, but it was like they just vanished." I swallowed. "I went back once," he continued, "years later, just to see the house again." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "I stood in the backyard right where you saw her, and for a second, I thought I saw someone in the window." I shivered. "The little girl?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." I knew what he meant. The woman. The one in the nightgown. I stared at the tabletop, my thoughts spinning. "Why now?" I asked. "Why is she back?" Dad didn't answer right away. He just took another slow sip of his drink. Then quietly, "Maybe she never left." The words settled between us like a weight. I thought about the photo, the footprints, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. We never left. Maybe she wasn't just talking about the Hendricks. Maybe she meant all of them. Everything in me wanted to believe it was over, that locking the doors and checking the windows was enough. But deep down, I knew the truth. Somewhere, in the dark corners of this house, something still lingered, waiting, watching, and next time, I wasn't sure if she'd leave at all.